Okay. All right, pull up your notes I found this morning. I'm going to continue on with section 2. Those of you guys who weren't here yesterday, you got to watch the video from yesterday. So yesterday, starting section 2 here, we were kind of talking about and basically the essence of the Renaissance is basically art, right? And art has, like I said, we were talking about chapter 1 and cave paintings and the Cro-Magnons. Art is inherently kind of something that's kind of hardwired into us, the idea of kind of expression in that. And in the Middle Ages, in the early and high Middle Ages, there was art, obviously. But in many cases, like, one of the values that we had talked about that kind of separates medieval art from Renaissance art is the celebration of the individual. We kind of see this is where the artist is kind of elevated to kind of rock star status, but also the people that would basically employ these artists, what they call the patrons of the arts, the Medici, the Borgias, all these. These are people that like the Medici in particular, were people like during the Middle Ages probably wouldn't have had like portrait paintings and kind of employed these guys because they're kind of a newer class of people during the high Middle Ages, basically the merchant class. So we see celebration of individuals, artists, and subjects as well. We see them basically kind of level classical learning, the concept of humanism and humanities right there, the idea of basically kind of harkening back to Greek and Roman culture, and then just basically enjoying worldly pleasure, enjoying yourself, right? Which is kind of stems out of the heaviness that the Black Death kind of created, where people like life is short. And the Medici were famous for basically, what's the purpose of wealth if you really can't enjoy it? And so one aspect of that for people like Cosimo and Lorenzo and all the other kind of Medicis that were the patrons of the arts was employing the kind of preeminent kind of artists of the day. To beautify the city, but also to basically kind of show off their wealth and status, right? And so I talked about, before we started talking about Ninja Turtles, I talked about a couple patrons that are going to be this kind of conduit, this kind of bridge between medieval and kind of Renaissance art. One was kind of Giotto da Ponte, who was born in the 13th century. He kind of brought back the concept of frescoes. He was also an architect. He designed the tower there at the Cathedral of Florence. And then Masaccio, who was a contemporary, knew Brunelleschi, the guy who created the dome at the Florence Cathedral, and that concept of linear perspective. Masaccio employs that concept of perspective to give kind of like paintings, kind of three-dimension sense of depthness. All right. And then we had talked about the first Ninja Turtle being Donatello, who was primarily a sculptor. He also was friends with Brunelleschi. So when Brunelleschi lost that contest to redesign the doors of the baptistry in Florence, he went to Rome. Donatello went with it. So while Brunelleschi's observing essentially like the kind of the Pantheon and the Colosseum, and that Donatello's observing kind of statues. So he was one of the first kind of artists to be basically commissioned by Cosimo de' Medici in 1434. He created a statue, was the first kind of freestanding, meaning not connected to a wall or a building, of a new figure since the time of the Romans. His kind of take on David was a little controversial, where it kind of portrays David as almost kind of feminine to a certain extent. But again, that was the idea of kind of pushing the envelope. Like I said, a lot of times art, if it doesn't really kind of invoke a kind of a response, it's really doing its job. And then we moved into the high Renaissance, talking about the first Ninja Turtle, Michelangelo, who was known initially as a sculptor with his version of David, which is the quintessential one. But also he has a number of relief paintings, frescoes, most famous one being the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in Vatican City. Sistine Chapel is where they would hold the conclave to elect a new pope. The College of Cardinals was there. So there's like over 300 kind of human figures, many from stories from the Bible, that are essentially kind of painted throughout the city. He spent nearly 3 years straight just on his back on scaffolding. It took him a while to paint this. There's a lot going on in the Sistine Chapel. There's other paintings from other artists, like Botticelli's got some paintings there. But nearly every inch is kind of covered. This is probably the most famous kind of like panel there. That's the creation of man, right? You've probably seen that if you've ever gone to an Olive Garden. That's right up here, right here in the Sistine Chapel. And then on the back wall, he came back later to kind of paint this kind of back wall there called the Last Judgment, which is lots to unpack in that painting. It's basically the day that Jesus returns. What he's done is kind of portrayed up here as heaven. here is purgatory, down here is hell. And so, like, this is his image of Jesus and the Virgin Mary, which, again, the video talked about yesterday, had this concept of ideal forms here. Jesus is pretty swole in this kind of image here. Now, not everybody was a fan. There was one guy named Giorgio Chesnia who was he was the Pope's master of ceremonies, which basically was his right-hand man. He's the guy important for scheduling and stuff like that. He was very critical of Michelangelo and all the new bodies that were kind of portrayed in here. So Michelangelo is a temperamental artist and somewhat of a genius, doesn't really take kindly to criticism. So instead of saying, oh, okay, I'll take that to heart, he puts Chesnia in the painting at the very lower right hand and portrays him, puts him in hell, and portrays it as King Minos, all right, one of the judges of hell, and has donkey ears put on, basically to say, you're a jackass, all right, and then has a serpent wrapped around him that has basically clutched onto a very sensitive part of the anatomy. Now, when Chesnia sees this, he goes to Pope Paul III and says, look at him, are you, yes, are you, he's got to change it. That's not, and Paul apparently told Chesnia that his areas of kingdom that he controls is on earth and on heaven. Hell is not his realm, all right? And so he stays in there for perpetuity. So Chesnia is famous for that. And then this is an image of St. Bartholomew, because a lot of the images are of early saints and martyrs. Bartholomew was an early saint who was flayed alive. Basically, he was skinned alive. So in this, he's holding his flayed skin. To make it even stranger, Michelangelo put his face on that flayed skin. So he kind of put a little Easter egg in there, all right? And so, again, this is kind of, there's a lot to kind of unpack there, all right? And what was Michelangelo's color? He was orange, right?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Moving on to our third Ninja Turtle and second great artist of the High Renaissance, that would be Leonardo.
Da Vinci was a painter such as the world had never seen. In his Annunciation, he created a light effect. The mysterious light suggests the divine presence in a never-never land. An angel wears an accurate depiction of birds' wings based on his detailed studies of birds. The density of air currents, lights and shadows so subtle as to be barely perceptible. Leonardo da Vinci made great use of chiaroscuro, which is the play of light and dark and shadows. He said to other painters, be careful to see that among the shadows, there are other shadows. In Leonardo's The Virgin of the Rocks, he uses his favorite composition, the triangle. Here Mary, the angel, and the child form an isosceles triangle of color. In a rock cave, they heighten the effect of light and darkness. His knowledge of optics is at work here to create a great open space. Once again, that never-never land of gauze-like light in the background signifies the spirit. Notice the face of the angel with the arresting hair. It is that sweet, puzzling beauty of the Mona Lisa, which he uses again and again. Beauty that is almost painful. The Iron Duke, Ludovico, asked Leonardo to paint the Last Supper, to honor his deceased wife at the convent of Santa Maria delle Grazie. Da Vinci did not want to use fresco, which is painting directly into wet plaster, because it took too much time. So he invented an oil and tempera mixture which proved disastrous. The painting never fully dried, and has since become hopelessly spotted. Nevertheless, it is one of the greatest paintings of all time. It is a perfect composition in triangle, in which all lines go directly to the right eye of Christ, who has just told the supper guests, one among you shall betray me. The majestic and somber room adds to the drama. Christ alone is serene. Behind him is that gauzy never-never land light again. Everyone else is animated in shock. Leonardo said, the painter should notice the sudden gestures which people make without thinking when moved by strong sentiments. Not long afterward, Ludovico lost his sovereignty over Milan. He was chased out of power by Louis XII of France, and Da Vinci wandered from city to city until he wound up again in Florence. It is here that he painted a work of surpassing beauty and strangeness, which has held the interest of the world for the 500 years since it was painted. It is the Mona Lisa. Great beauty must have some strangeness in it, and the Mona Lisa certainly has beauty and strangeness in abundance. And both are deliberate choices. The landscape of the two sides of the picture do not match up. Viewer's left is higher than the right. The eyes are not the same. Notice the corners of the lips. One side curls and one side does not. So subtle are these asymmetrical parts that they present the viewer with a mystery. The Mona Lisa has an inner secret that we cannot unravel. She stares with an inner life that we have never seen before in a picture, ancient or modern. It is as if she were just asked a question and is thinking whether to tell us the truth or to spare our feelings and tell us a story. One writer said, looking at her then, you can swear that her pulse was beating. Mona Lisa is the most famous painting in the world.
So our third Ninja Turtle, second great artist of the High Renaissance, Leonardo da Vinci. Da Vinci might be kind of classified as a polymath, all right, maybe somebody in that traditional sense who's not just an artist, but he kind of delves into kind of science, biology, engineering, architecture, and that. But he's more famous as a painter, obviously. His kind of two most famous paintings, like I mentioned in the video there, are The Last Supper, which is this tempera fresco that's in a kind of chapel in Milan, commissioned by the Duke of Milan for his wife. And then the Mona Lisa, which is a portrait painting of Lisa Gioconda, who was the wife of a Florentine merchant. All right, which is one of those examples where we have find people that probably wouldn't have had kind of like a kind of a portrait painting maybe a couple hundred years before. So, Da Vinci, there's been a lot, like say, like 2005 when they came out that book, the Da Vinci Code. There's a lot of stuff like conspiracies and rumors and stuff like that, kind of like they're kind of tied in with Da Vinci. The Last Supper, like I said here, there was like in that book, and a lot of people, art historians, have kind of focused on certain things like this is the moment in which Jesus informs the apostles that one of them is going to betray him. Obviously, that's Judas. And so the idea is your kind of eyes kind of drawn to the right part of Jesus. You see the kind of perspective in the background there. And so in that conspiracy with the Da Vinci Code, which is kind of historical fiction, which is things a little bit of oxymoron, this is Mary Magdalene, according to that. And there is no Holy Grail. There's no cup, there's chalice. The Grail is the womb of Mary Magdalene that's supposed to represent it. Now, other art historians can easily refute this, basically stating that this is St. Thomas, who was the youngest of the apostles. And in other Renaissance paintings, Thomas is portrayed as somewhat feminine, all right, because he's the youngest. But they've spoken like over here, it's supposed to be St. Peter, who is giving kind of a menacing kind of like hand gesture there, if that was Mary Magdalene. And then I said in art historians, they actually claim that these aren't the apostles, that down here, this is Homer and Virgil, who were the ones who kind of wrote the Iliad and Odyssey. All right, but there's been a lot of kind of focus and stuff on that. As like I said, it's been spotted, it's been retouched multiple times. And then there's the Mona Lisa, right, which is located in the Louvre in Paris. It is in France, even though Da Vinci is Florentine, because he ended his days in the court of the King of France. Matter of fact, the King of France was at his bedside. All right. The painting is not very big. It's just kind of ready for it. It takes up an entire wall there. Matter of fact, I was more fascinated. There was another painting across the way. There was a massive painting called The Wedding of Cana, which is the story of Jesus turning water into wine, and that by another kind of Renaissance artist. The problem is that when you go there, you see people are like trying to make a beeline to it. And there's all these people just basically like kind of like in a crowd there, kind of there. For somebody short like myself, it gets kind of tough to kind of see, if you will. It's okay. I'm a painting. I'm not much of an art historian. Like it's all right. But the thing about it is that there's a legend that's with it. All right. And so this video talks about at one point how it was stolen.
If you want praise of Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa as art, you can find it.
Indeed, the interplay of light, where the knowledge and duality is considered illuminating.
But what if you think it's just fine? What's the cynic's explanation for the Mona Lisa? Why is the Mona Lisa so famous? Is it really that much better than Da Vinci's Lady with Ermine? That seems better. There's one more ermine. But it's Mona who is so famous that the director of the Louvre, where Mona Lisa lives, said 80% of their visitors are only there to see that one painting. If you don't think Mona Lisa is famous just because she's somehow 10 times better than every other painting, her story reveals something more interesting. Something about how art breaks into wider culture, and it might never have happened if the Mona Lisa hadn't disappeared. Before Mona Lisa became a mass culture star, before she vanished, one critic made her a work of art worth taking. And he was so over the top, insanely in love with the painting that he single-handedly made it a masterpiece. Walter Pater's 1873 book, The Renaissance, was key. It came out more than 350 years after Leonardo painted Mona Lisa, but it defined the painting for Victorians. That was key in an age when it was hard to actually see the art, so the words did the work. Here is the epic semicolon stuffed paragraph at the center of his Ode to Mona Lisa. Highlights?
The animalism of Greece. She is older than the rocks among which she sits. Like the vampire, she has been dead many times.
This was the purplest prose of all time, but people loved this stuff. Oscar Wilde thought the essay's writing was great. He praised the musical of the mystical prose and every general interest profile of the Louvre, from academic guidebooks to discussion clubs in Paducah, used Pater's words to talk about Mona. Other critics jumped on. Mona was a popular, secular painting that they could analyze. Unlike Da Vinci's Last Supper, they could supply all the meaning. But even at her peak, Mona Lisa was just art world famous, not the most famous painting of all time. In 1907, a vandal at the Louvre targeted a picture by Ingres, not Da Vinci. And in 1910, amidst rumors of theft, papers called Mona just the second most famous painting in the Louvre, after Raphael's Sistina Madonna. It took a real theft to take Mona from art syllabus highlight to mass culture icon. These are Vincenzo Peruggia's fingerprints. This is Vincenzo Peruggia's mugshot. He has one because on August 21st, 1911, the former Louvre worker lifted the Mona Lisa off the wall and took it home. It took the Louvre a day to even notice, but the media didn't have as subdued of a reaction. The painting went missing for 2 years, and every time the press, often quoting Pater, called it the greatest portrait there ever was. They speculated that Mona's smile had driven the thief mad. They wrote art thief fan fiction, and they constantly daydreamed about Mona Lisa's whereabouts. Thousands went to the Louvre just to see empty hooks hanging on the wall. The robbery and manhunt were like a 2-year ad campaign for the painting. And because you couldn't just Google Mona Lisa before it was stolen, it was hard for people to see the actual painting and say, what's the big deal? When Peruggia was caught, he said his goal was to bring Mona back to her native Italy. By then, she was the most famous painting in the world, due in part to her absence. Just as critics could smear prose on her blank face, the press could paint a reputation on those empty hooks in the wall. When Mona Lisa was stolen, she left a masterpiece. After her recovery and a 2-week tour in Florence, she returned to the Louvre bigger than just art. She was a story and a legend, and prominently shown in every paper that reported her recovery. It was the big reveal after 2 years of suspense, now with a story that merited Walter Pater's hyperbole. From that point on, she attracted presidential speeches and parodies.
Also come to pay homage to this great creation of the civilization which we share.
The momentum never stopped. In the end, the cynic's interpretation and the gobsmacked critic's interpretation have something in common. Mona Lisa isn't a portrait, but a blank face, a place for critics to paint meaning and people to find mystery. That's why she was so famous, not because of how she's painted, but what we see in her. If that's not art, then what is?
So actually, one of the individuals of question for the theft was Pablo Picasso. Picasso was part of a kind of group of young painters that were somewhat critical of the Louvre for not including kind of more modern art in that. And so he was brought in for questioning. He was obviously not the culprit. And then also too, Da Vinci is famous for, he has a number of these notebooks where, like, you know, these illustrations are very detailed. Probably the most famous kind of illustration from these notebooks is Vitruvian Man, which is supposedly the kind of like perfect proportions geometrically of kind of humans. Named after Vitruvius, who was a Roman architect. And in these kind of notes, I mean, he would observe like anatomy, you know, from like, you know, like carcasses and stuff like that, you know. This is a kind of a fetus there. This is his kind of illustrations of bone structure for like kind of like art purposes and that. The thing about these notes is they're all his notes are written backwards. He writes everything very backwards so nobody could see, you know, I guess kind of decipher it, I guess. That is the only theory that we can kind of come up with, but that's kind of genius, like, if you will. And then what a lot of people don't really kind of focus on is the end of his life. Like, he was in the court of the King of France. He spent basically kind of building, like kind of designing kind of weaponry, war machines, if you will. This is what they believe is his kind of his idea for a plane, right? You see kind of the use of kind of bird wings, if you will. And his idea for a tank, which his ideas were a little bit ahead of their time, all right? But that's why, you know, he did that for the Duke of Milan and later for the King of France, all right? And then our last Ninja Turtle, Raphael.
Raphael of Sanjo, or Raphael, was born in 1483. He was 8 years younger than Michelangelo and 31 years younger than Leonardo. His painting excelled in every field and style except the nude, of which Michelangelo was the master. However, Raphael's Madonnas have inspired the devout for 4 centuries as none other. His Madonna of the Goldfinch is gentle and tame, unlike Michelangelo's angry view. Here, St. John offers the Christ child a little goldfinch. The child's hand hovers over the little feathered head. Raphael's Holy Family lives in a world of young trees, flowers. All is tame, orderly, and harmonious. The sun sets softly on landscapes and churches and water. God is in his heaven, and all is right in the world in which Raphael paints. Raphael was criticized for being too sweet, too saccharine, but he was capable of showing an entirely different side. In his portrait of Angelo Doni, the shrewd miser can be seen in this face. The technique he uses owes a great debt to Leonardo. It has the realism of Leonardo's Mona Lisa. Here we see Raphael use a light background to heighten the chiaroscuro, which Da Vinci developed. His painting of Pope Leo X has a ruthless truth. Here is a Medici who loved luxury. He was not a pretty sight in reality. You would not want to meet this face alone on a dark night. It is to Raphael's credit that he told this dark truth in this portrait. Raphael was only 37 when he died. Over his body was placed his painting, Transfiguration. Here, a boy is possessed by the devil. His eyes roll, his skin is bloodless. He gestures violently. The old man holding him looks to the apostles and to Christ for salvation. Raphael was a great illustrator. He knew how to tell a story. The treatment of light and dark, the chiaroscuro, adds to the drama of the story. All of the figures are touched by the holy light, which animates and affects the movements. The High Renaissance brought forth many artists of enormous achievement, but Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael were the guiding forces of the High Renaissance, and their force still touches our lives today.
All right, so our last Ninja Turtle, third artist of the High Renaissance, Raphael, Sandro. Raphael, red?
Yeah.
Thank you. And so, and again, Raphael is the youngest of the Ninja Turtles. The video didn't mention his probably most famous work is the School of Athens, which was essentially it was a kind of fresco for the library of Pope Julius II. But he's also a kind of a portrait painter for a number of popes, particularly Pope Leo X. But he does his kind of similar kind of like reliefs and such, like Michelangelo and Leonardo. The School of Athens is this painting that basically shows perspective, and it's essentially a nod to the humanists. It portrays individuals that were kind of lived in Athens during the kind of golden age of Athens, the 5th century and such. So this is the painting. Like you see, like the sense of depth with the archways, and so there's individuals like you see Socrates right there, Pericles is right here. You have Plato, Aristotle, Galen, Hippocrates, all the kind of these figures that are kind of associated with kind of like Athens at the time. This is what it looks like in the kind of library study there in the Vatican. All right. And then this is his portrait of Pope Leo X, which Leo wasn't very fond of, according to the historians. He portrayed like his fine black shadow was pretty evident, a little bit of a double chin there. And then this is his cousin. This is Leo's cousin, who later becomes Pope Clement VII. All right. And then this is his relief. The video talked about Madonna the Goldfinch. He uses the Holy Family in another painting called Madonna the Meadow, which this is very Da Vinci-like in the sense of the use of the triangle. Your eyes kind of drawn in within in that kind of sense there. Raphael is buried in the Pantheon in Rome. All right. And so his Transfiguration painting is right above his tomb there. Another kind of high Renaissance artist that I find is important, but he doesn't get as much mention because he's not a Ninja Turtle, is Alessandro Filippi, better known by his nickname Botticelli. Botticelli is probably the best at basically kind of infusing kind of Greek and Roman mythology into his painting. Mainly kind of the use of Venus or Aphrodite is a kind of a common theme throughout his paintings. His most famous painting, Birth of Venus, or Aphrodite there, La Primavera with Venus at the center, or Aphrodite. And then he has a painting called The Adoration of the Magi, which is the kind of the time when Jesus is basically brought out after he's born. Unfortunately, while there's a lot of paintings that are still in the Uffizi in Florence, a lot of Botticelli's paintings were destroyed by him. We'll talk about a guy next week named Girolamo Savonarola, who comes to power in Florence after the Medici are kind of kicked out, and he encourages people to get rid of these things in their possessions that are not necessary and religious. Unfortunately, Botticelli came under his spell. So this is the Adoration of the Magi. There's baby Jesus being presented here. Now over here are the Medici. This is Lorenzo de' Medici, his main patron here, Lorenzo the Magnificent. So basically what he's saying is that you guys are so important that if Jesus basically was kind of introduced today, you would be there. And then this guy right here, that's Botticelli himself. He kind of threw himself into the painting. This is La Primavera with Aphrodite or Venus at the center here. You have Mercury, the Graces, Flora, Zephyr, and then this is Birth of Venus. You may have seen this one before. This is probably the more famous one. The story of Aphrodite or Venus being born from the sea, foam risen, the shell kind of representing the womb, the same Zephyr, Flora, same type of figures. And then this is Mars and Venus. All right, so Venus is a popular figure within kind of Botticelli's kind of art. And then kind of moving outside of Florence as the kind of Renaissance kind of ripples out to places like Milan. Another place that has a kind of a vibrant kind of art scene is in Venice. And so one of the kind of originators of the Venice School, as they would call it, is Giorgio Barabelli da Castelfranco, who's known more by his kind of shortened name, Giorgio. And so in the Venice School, which really is hard, for somebody with a layperson with the kind of their kind of the eye that I have, there's not a lot of differences. They tend to, art historians tend to say that the Venice School uses a bit more kind of emphasis on colors and chiaroscuro than, let's say, triangles and shapes and stuff like that. But the differences, in my opinion, is incredibly slight. All right. And so, like I said, we start to see the Renaissance rippling out from Venice or from Florence into places like Venice and Milan and that. This is his self-portrait. A lot of these guys have their own self-portraits where they use mirrors and that. This is it's called Sleeping Venus. Again, using Venus as the kind of the backdrop there. And again, nudity is just part of the kind of harkening back to the Greeks and the Romans. This is a altarpiece that's at a church in Venice. one of the few altarpieces that are associated with Giorgione. This is where you do see like that emphasis on the triangle there. Obviously, the use of colors here with the Virgin Mary and kind of the backdrop there. A kind of contemporary of Giorgione is Tiziano Boccelli, who is more commonly known by his kind of short name Titian. Also kind of a member of the School of Venice. Titian is primarily making a living, and he does a fairly job. Like, you know, people like Michelangelo, particularly, they made a decent living. That whole idea of a starving artist. Da Vinci had some financial problems, I believe, but people like Michelangelo and Titian are going to make a decent living for themselves. Titian primarily has a clientele outside of Italy, mainly the Habsburgs. Almost every Habsburg, like kind of portrait that we have of Charles V, who I'll talk about next week, is usually painted by Titian. All right, so Titian and Giorgione are kind of the big two from Venice. There's Titian's self-portrait. This is profound, sacred and profound love with kind of Venus as the backdrop to the back there. The Assumption of the Virgin Mary at the moment in which Jesus was conceived. And then this is Bacchus and Antigone. Anytime they talk about Dionysus or Bacchus in videos, stuff like that, they usually show Titian's birth. So Titian does throw in, like Botticelli, some Greek mythology and Roman mythology. And then a guy that was essentially from Florence here, Vasari, Vasari is an important figure for multiple reasons. He's an accomplished painter of his own. He's the one who painted the frescoes inside of the Duomo there. But most importantly, he's a writer. He kind of development of kind of art history kind of starts with Vasari here. He writes a book called The Lives of the Most Excellent Painters, also as an architect. They mainly call it The Lives of Artists. This is where we get most of our information about Michelangelo and Leonardo and Raphael. All right. So he kind of starts this whole kind of concept of kind of analyzing that era for historical purposes. All right. There's his self-portrait. This is his Garden of Ganymede, which has some kind of like ties into the School of Venice. This is his portrait of Alessandro de' Medici, who was the illegitimate son of Clement VII, who was the Pope. Alessandro later becomes the first Duke of Florence. His mother was from Africa, so he's the first person of color who was a noble in Europe to lead a kind of a state as a noble. And then that's the cover of the Lives of the Arts. So on Monday, I'm just going to send you out a little worksheet, nothing big, but I think something that we had talked about. I think the Pieta worksheet. And then on Tuesday, I'm going to talk about the Northern Renaissance, places outside of Italy. And then we'll talk about the Reformation and that on Friday. Madison, did you get this?
Yep.
Okay, awesome. Have a good weekend.
You too.